What if I told you that the mightiest empire ever built, the one that painted the world red on the map, controlled oceans, and ruled over nearly a quarter of humanity, began to crumble not because of invasion nor rebellion, but because of greed? From the narrow cobbled streets of London to the palaces of India, gold glittered in every deal, every voyage, every conquest. Britain's empire rose on ambition, courage, and enterprise. But behind those noble words hid a darker force. The hunger for power, the lust for profit, the belief that the sun would never set on the British Empire, even as the light within it began to fade. It started with merchants and explorers, men who dreamt of fortunes across the seas. But soon trade turned into tyranny. Commerce became conquest. The East India Company, once a humble trading firm, grew into a monstrous power that ruled entire nations, making kings and breaking empires in its shadow. Yet what began as the pursuit of prosperity became a story of corruption, cruelty, and betrayal. A tale of how an empire built on greed devoured itself from within. This is not just the story of Britain's greatest triumphs. It's the story of its downfall, a chilling reminder that no empire, no matter how rich, can escape the weight of its own greed. Welcome to How Greed Destroyed the World's Richest Empire. Our story begins in the closing years of the 16th century, an age of sails, silk, and ambition. Britain was not yet the mighty empire it would become. Spain and Portugal ruled the seas, their ships heavy with gold and spices from the New World and the East. England watched envious and hungry. In 1600, a group of London merchants gathered under candlelight and ambition. They sought permission from Queen Elizabeth I to form a company that would open the gates of the East to English trade. And so, the Honorable East India Company was born. At first, it was just trade, cloth, spices, tea, and silk. But with every voyage, profits soared higher. The company's influence began to stretch from the docks of London to the palaces of Indian princes. The British Crown, sensing opportunity, allowed the company almost complete freedom. They were merchants, but they acted like kings. By the 1700s, the East India Company had its own private army, over 260,000 men, larger than the standing army of Britain itself. It had the power to wage war, sign treaties, collect taxes, and even execute justice. A corporation had become an empire in all but name, but power once tasted demands more. The line between commerce and conquest vanished. Behind polite ledgers and contracts lay blood, betrayal, and the beginnings of something monstrous. As the East India Company tightened its grip on India, wealth began to flow back to Britain in unimaginable amounts. London's mansions gleamed with gold, its banks overflowed, and its politicians, many of whom were shareholders, turned a blind eye to how that wealth was earned. The merchants had become masters, and greed had found its throne. The 18th century marked the true rise of Britain's empire. The East India Company became more than a business. It became a government, ruling over millions. The British weren't just traders anymore. They were rulers of vast lands thousands of miles away. In Bengal, the richest province of India, company officials exploited local kings and farmers, seizing their resources under the pretext of protection and partnership. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 sealed their fate. With a handful of British officers and a fortune in bribes, the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal. From that moment, India was theirs. Millions of pounds of revenue poured into British hands. Tea, silk, opium, and cotton fed an empire's hunger for wealth. Company officials lived like emperors, their fortunes so vast they returned to Britain as nabobs, building mansions, buying titles, and influencing Parliament itself. But as their riches grew, so did their corruption. Behind the splendor lay famine, suffering, and despair. The greed that built the empire was already beginning to rot its foundations. And in the heart of it all, one truth echoed: when profit becomes power, humanity becomes the price. By the early 19th century, Britain was the richest nation on earth. London was the beating heart of global trade. But its empire and its wealth were soaked in blood. The East India Company now ruled more people than the British government itself. It dictated laws, raised armies, and enslaved economies. But behind closed doors, its directors were losing control. Corruption ran rampant. Fortunes vanished overnight. Company men gambled away entire provinces, bribed native rulers, and silenced dissent. The turning point came with the Indian Rebellion of 1857, a storm of rage ignited by decades of exploitation. Indian soldiers who had once served under the company turned their weapons on it. Towns burned, cities fell, and the illusion of invincibility shattered. For the first time, the British faced the consequence of their greed. The rebellion exposed the company for what it truly was, a machine of corruption and cruelty. When the smoke cleared, the British Crown dissolved the East India Company. Its territories were seized, its empire absorbed directly into the British government. The monster had devoured itself. With the fall of the East India Company came a new chapter, the British Raj. The empire that had once been built on private greed now became a state-run system. The Queen replaced merchants as ruler. The Union Jack rose where company flags once flew. But though the name changed, the greed remained. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Its wealth, its workforce, its heart. Railways, telegraphs, and cities were built, but always to serve Britain's benefit. Famine swept the land while grain was exported to feed Europe. The riches of India built Britain's factories, powered its navy, and funded its wars. The empire was stronger than ever, but its foundations were still made of exploitation. Greed had simply changed its uniform. For centuries, the British Empire was celebrated as a force for civilization, progress, and enlightenment. History books called it the empire on which the sun never sets. But behind that shining myth was a far darker truth. The roads, railways, and education systems were not gifts, they were tools of control. The British didn't civilize India. They extracted it. Its resources, its labor, its identity. And the profits that flowed to London left behind poverty that would scar generations. Even within Britain, many began to question the cost. Philosophers, poets, and politicians warned that an empire built on greed could not last. And they were right. As the 20th century dawned, revolutions, independence movements, and wars would tear apart what greed had built. The British Empire, once the richest in the world, began to fade, leaving behind shadows of glory and echoes of guilt. The fall of Britain's empire wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow unraveling, a consequence written in gold and blood. The empire that conquered the world was conquered by its own corruption. Greed had built an empire greater than Rome, and destroyed it just as surely. Today, the story of that empire stands as both a warning and a lesson. That no matter how vast the power, how rich the coffers, or how high the ambition, when greed becomes the heartbeat of a nation, its destiny is already written. Because in the end, empires don't fall from the outside. They crumble from within. This was how greed destroyed the world's richest empire, told by legends of Britain.